Good afternoon. I know the purpose of our gathering today is to focus on the Osages and their history in this area. But I believe that to really get a fully understanding of the Osages' migration and movement and where we were on the landscape is to really go back and see the full history as we have understood it. And what I would like to do is present that history in a very summarized presentation. When we talk about our history, we have to focus on the information that we have available to us. We look at the archaeological evidence. We look at the linguistic evidence. We look at the oral traditions that the tribal members have imparted to ethnographers and cultural anthropologists. We look at the archaeology very closely, and that's where my part comes in, is as an archaeologist, I have looked closely at the record and trying to pull together all of this information. And as a tribal member, we have to look at our traditions as well and what our people have said about where we come from. So when I pull that information together, we start with our creation story. And this is very important because it gives us our perspective of where we were on the landscape that we can then investigate. So when we talk about that, the creation story, we have to look closely at those early writings. And they talk about the elders in the different clans. Some of these creation stories were a little bit different, but they all had some of the very core concepts within each of them. And what they talk about is that the Osages were, in the very earliest beginning, that Osages were spiritual beings, actual spirits up in the heavens. And they desired very much to come down to earth. They had that knowledge of an earth below them. And they slowly went to each of the entities and asked for help to give them a formal body and to come down to earth. And they asked a lot of entities, and finally there was one that would help them, and this was the eagle. And so the eagle told them that, to follow him and he would take them down to earth. And they did so, and they did so in 3 groups. And they circled down through the different heavens. There were 4. And they traveled following the eagle as he moved through. And he followed them all the way down to earth. And when they got to earth, they landed. He told them to, do exactly as he did. And as they landed in the oak trees, then you could see that they had a formal body at that time. And so our creation story talks about this and how once they landed in the trees, there was water all over the surface of the earth. And they called on different beings, such as the water spider and the leech, asking them to help them come out of the trees and come down to solid earth. And it wasn't until they talked to the great elk, and he helped them come down, Opong Tonka. He helped them by bellowing to the 4 winds and spreading the waters out. And then the Osages came down in 3 groups out of the trees, and they started walking across the landscape. And as they did, the first group, they came across a body of water, and there was a water spirit in the water. And he talked to the little ones, and he said, if you take, the energy in my spirit and what I can do as the physical being of water and the strength of water, you will live to see old age. Then he said, I'm going to name you, that first group. The first group is, he said, I'm going to give you the name of Osage, which means water people. And he said it also means name givers. He said, you're going to name the other 2 groups. And so the Osage then in turn named the the sky people, Tsichu. And then he also named the land people Hunka. And then they traveled, the oral tradition then goes on to talk about how they traveled the earth and they started forming their clans. So this is our tradition of how we actually first started. So we take this oral tradition, and you can see that it's still very much a part of our tribe. In our congressional chambers, we have a mural which depicts the oak trees and the Osages coming down and then going out on the landscape. And you can see some of the totems depicted in our congressional chambers here. These oral traditions are the only means of how information was passed down in the beginning. There was no writing. The Osages never had a writing system in prehistory. But we do have very strong traditions that are given by our linguistic Siouan speakers that are closest to us, the Degiha. In the Omaha, the Ponca, the Kaw, the Quapaw, all have oral traditions that talk about how we at one time were one group. We spoke the same language, and we were a large, if you will, a tribe, so to speak. And each of the tribes have this, and they also talk about where we were on the landscape. They talk about us being in the Ohio River Valley, and we were one group at that time. Some of the traditions also talk about even further back east, the Chesapeake Bay area, that we go that far back on the landscape in that memory of those elders that were imparting this information back in the 1800s, early 1900s. So this is our old tradition. These are a type of information that we rely upon. And as an archaeologist, I look at that information and tie it to the record that we have amassed as another profession, as a scientific profession. We have the native science, which is the oral traditions, and we've got the Western science of archaeology. And so we're trying to match those to come up with what would be the most accurate interpretation of who we are and where we were on the landscape. And so if we look at the record, the archaeological record, we have time periods arbitrarily named according to the archaeology that is represented in tools, for instance, living conditions, houses, language. And so we match those, and then we chunk this up into different time periods. If we look at the Ohio River Valley, there is the woodland period. The middle woodland period runs from roughly 100 BC to AD 500. And so looking at the archaeological record, this is where I think that we can start our investigations with a knowledge that I, as a scientist, can believe that this is where we were in time, based on the evidence. And so if we go through to the next period, towards the latter part of the Middle Woodland period, AD 200 to 400, we see a migration, a movement out of the Ohio River Valley. And in the archaeological evidence that we have, we can see changes on the landscape, changes in what we're seeing at these archaeological sites. Another line of evidence that we look at is the linguistic evidence. And in the past, we had a system that linguists were using. It was called glottochronology, but it was not really reliable. We have a new type of information, a line of evidence that Bob Rankin chose to investigate. And what he did was take some core words such as corn, beans, squash, the bow. He took words that were common amongst all 5 of the Degiha tribes. And these are words about objects, about corn, the kernel of the corn, the seed of the squash, a bow, what would be associated with the bow, the arrow points that were used with those bows. These are tangible objects that we as archaeologists can find. And so what he was doing was looking at changes in those core words in all 5 of the Degiha tribes and looking at how these words changed. And when you see change, then that means that not only in the language itself, it's the people that are changing. And what's happening is we know that all 5 groups ended up splitting. And so this is what one of the purposes was of this investigation, was to identify when the tribes split off and match that to the archaeological record is what we did, is looking and combining these lines of evidence. So we're looking at a time period around AD 400 where Rankin identifies the first split of the Degiha group. And what we're looking at is this migration down the Ohio River, and around 400, 500 AD, they arrive at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio River. And at this confluence, this is when the first split occurs. The Quapaw decide, the group that would become the Quapaw, decide to turn south and go downriver, and so, or downstream, which is what their name reflects. So the Quapaw turn off, and this is somewhere around 400, 500 AD. At that point, the rest of the group, the Ponca, the Omaha, the Osage, and the Kaw, all go north. And so we travel, so this is where at the confluence we have the split. And then starting AD 500 to 900, we see the other 4 remaining Degiha groups start to migrate up the Mississippi River and then out into the tributaries of Illinois and Missouri. And we see this, again, reflected in the archaeological evidence, the change in the types of tools that they were using, the change in utilitarian objects that they were creating. We have pottery that is changing. The substance that they're using to create the paste and the pottery changes because it's a new group coming in, and that new group is us as we start to go across the landscape and are setting up our camps and villages. Then around what is known, the archaeologists refer to as the emergent Mississippian period, is when we see a shift in the location of habitations. We see some of these groups starting to coalesce and come back to what is now the St. Louis area. And at this point, around 900 AD, the emergent Mississippian, we see this collective that starts to create a massive, what would become essentially an early metropolis. And during this time, we see in the archaeological record, of course, this location with the large mounds, the Cahokia mounds. If you've ever been over on the east side of the Mississippi and the Illinois side, there is a huge National Heritage Site, the Cahokia mounds. And at this location, there's something on the order of probably 20,000 people are estimated during its height. Some even go as high as 30,000, but I think we can safely say somewhere around 20,000 at this location. And they were engaging in long-distance trade to all coasts. Their political and economic basis was expanded tremendously during this period. So this is starting around AD 900, 1000 AD. But at this juncture, according to the linguistic evidence, then we see another change. And at this point, we see the Omaha, what would become the Omaha and the Ponca, split off. Now we've got the 4 that were there, along with other tribes. We're not the only ones that are there. There are other tribes that are also there, But according to the archaeological record, the iconography studies, it appears that the Degiya group was the strongest represented tribes, what would become tribes later. And so at 1000 AD, we see the Omaha and the Ponca leave. And in the oral traditions, they talk about how the Omaha and Ponca, there's two renditions that are given. Some say that they went up the Mississippi River and then across at the Des Moines. Another record says that they just move straight eastward up the Missouri River. So we have a couple of different traditions that talk about that departure. In the linguistic evidence, it is also evident, according to Rankin's work, is that at 1000 AD, we see the Omaha and the Ponca split off. So now that leaves the Osage and the Kaw that are there at this location, primarily in this central location in the St. Louis area, but also in the hinterlands. You can't forget that, you know, we're also out there. You've got to support that metropolis. So you've got villages that are in the tributaries up in the landscape in Illinois and also in the Mississippi, Missouri, eastern side of the Mississippi River. In the linguistic evidence, Rankin indicates that at 1200 AD is when the Kaw split off. And in their oral traditions, they talk about that movement, again, up the Missouri River, and of course they travel on up until they get to the Kansas, northeastern Kansas. So we're matching the archaeological record, the linguistic evidence, and the oral traditions. And this is what appears to be our interpretation of our movements across this landscape. And so when we get to about 1300, 1350, we see a huge decline at Cahokia. And at this point, this is when what would become the Osage, we start moving out across what is really our backyard. The state of Missouri, the northern part of Arkansas. We go out into the landscape and now are starting to use the area as a habitation area of what was formerly our hunting grounds, our trading grounds. We're now moving and a much diminished population than what was at Cahokia. So we see this movement, and the result is we essentially are in this location, this area of Missouri and Arkansas for several hundred years, from roughly about really 500 AD to when we start the land cessions in 1808. So we've got throughout this territory sites that are extremely important to us that we as archaeologists can identify. And there's a variety of sites that are out there, such as our camps, our hunting camps, our trails, our sacred sites, burial sites, hundreds of these across the landscape. The trails, we have mapped several of these, showing our movement across the landscape. There's several more that we have since identified, and we're continuing to update this map. But you can see our movement across the landscape is widespread out into the plains. Our sacred sites are extremely important to us, and we talk about what we do as a tribe in our Historic Preservation Office. This is really important for us to try to identify these areas to help save them from destruction through development and so forth. So we are actively engaged in trying to locate and protect these areas. Sacred sites include caves and hilltops where our burial cairns are located, the rock shelters. These are all sacred sites to us that really are expansive across the landscape. The rock cairns a lot of times are misidentified because people do not understand what they are when they see them. We've got mound sites such as Sugarloaf Mound, an extremely sacred site to us. Rock art depicts some of our dances, as you can see in Arkansas. Rock art in Missouri. We've got Picture Cave, which is extremely important to us, that actually shows our creation story. These are areas that we certainly are trying to save. But at this point, when we're in Missouri, time marches on, 1673, and we see the Osages, our first contact, and this is what brings us into an area that is closer to Claremore. And what we're doing here today is that we're increasing our movement out into the plains. We're still in Missouri, but we're utilizing the plains and coming down here. These are our hunting grounds at this time when we see the first contact. We engage with the French. We have a really good relationship with them in the beginning. The economic aspect of it, we caught on. It didn't take us long to see the advantages of engaging in that economic development with the fur trade. Looking closely at that relationship, we also find out that our name has actually been very much corrupted. That if you look at the three clans, we had the Osage, the Tsichu, and the Hunka. Originally, that wasn't our name. It was Neokonska. That Neokonska was the name of the whole tribe. You had each of those divisions that were given by our clans. But our true name is Neokonska, Children of the Middle Waters, because we have always had a very close connection to water and the strength of it. During this early French period, we see this in the archaeological record. I have done excavations at these sites, and we see a very clear picture of what starts to happen in terms of our cultural traditions and how they are impacted. We come down to, go through the Spanish control, then the American control, and then that's when we have the Louisiana Purchase, and we start seeing a whole nother chapter in our history of what would lead to land cessions. But we are actively in the state of Oklahoma, still trading and hunting out in what is this territory right here in Claremore. Unfortunately, we start to engage in our land cessions in 1808, and you can see we have a whole series of land cessions, which includes this area that we're in right now in Claremore. This was our homelands. This is lands that we initially had to succeed to cession to the United States. In total, and if you look at this, it was a tremendous amount of land, and what we received from it was approximately about 1 penny for every 6 acres. It was a really sad history of what happened to us in our land loss. But in 1865 is when we finally make the agreement that we're going to move down into Oklahoma. And this is where we create our last reservation over in Osage County. And it's just an interesting story of how this was our land and we had to cede it. Literally, Claremore, this land, we had to cede it over to the United States, and then we actually end up buying back our own land from the Cherokee. It's a really interesting turn of events that our tribe went through. But in totality, you can see our landscape of what we have created as our ancestral territory. This includes the earliest land in the Ohio River Valley, but all of the territory that we have hunted and lived in, engaged in the slave trade that took us down to Louisiana. It is quite an expansive territory. So when you think about this area in Claremore, my counterparts here, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Swan are going to talk specifically about the trails that I showed you, the location of these villages, and of course some of the events that occurred here. My purpose of my presentation is just trying to show you what led up to us being in this area. We've been here for quite a long time. This was our land for many hundreds of years. And so at that point, this will be the turning of the guard here, and we'll let the historians pick up on the history. Okay? Thank you.